There is a quiet belief we rarely question, the belief that we are conscious for most of our lives. That we choose, decide, and conduct our days with clarity. But what if that isn't true? What if much of what we call, who I am, is nothing more than repetition? What if the freedom we believe we have is, in practice, merely the right to repeat the same pattern with minor variations? Perhaps the greatest paradox of modern life is this: we have never had so much access to information, and we have never been so distant from ourselves. We rush, produce, react, consume, and we call this living. But at some silent point something begins to fail. A tiredness that doesn't go away. A feeling that the day ends without having truly been lived. This is not a lack of discipline. It is an absence of consciousness. What almost no one says is that we are not prisoners of external chaos, but of invisible internal structures. There are emotional, mental, and symbolic circuits that organize our choices before we even notice them. We call this habit. But habit, when seen deeply, is not just behavior. It is a way of existing in the world. This video is not about productivity, self-control, or personal success. It is about something rarer: noticing when life is happening without you. Using a well-known work not as a manual but as a mirror. Not to explain but to pass through. Because there is a kind of knowledge that does not accumulate, it awakens. If something in you feels that you are living on autopilot but you don't quite know how to step out of it, stay. I don't promise shortcuts. I promise clarity. And sometimes, that is already the beginning of everything. Invisible automatism, when life happens without you. There is a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, when we realize that days are passing, but something in us is not truly present. It is not a collapse, not an explicit crisis. It is subtler than that. We wake up, complete tasks, answer messages, work, eat, sleep, and yet, at the end of the day, a strange sense of absence remains. As if life were happening but not exactly with us. When I read The Power of Habit, I don't hear only an explanation of repetitive behaviors. I hear an uncomfortable whisper about this absence of presence. There is something deeply unsettling, and at the same time liberating, about the idea that much of our life is lived on autopilot. Not because we are weak, distracted, or incapable, but because the human brain has learned over time to conserve energy. The problem is that when this mechanism expands too far, it doesn't just automate actions, it automates existence itself. And then, without realizing it, we begin to call who I am what are, in truth, nothing more than unquestioned repetitions. You may recognize this in small, everyday scenes. Driving to work and not remembering the route. Opening your phone without knowing exactly why. Saying I'm fine without checking what you actually feel. Eating without hunger. Complaining without noticing. Promising change and, days later, repeating the exact same patterns. None of this is dramatic in isolation. The impact emerges when we realize that these small automatisms, added together, build an entire life. What Duhigg's work reveals, even when it does not state it explicitly, is that habit is not just a behavior, it is a state of consciousness. A way of being in the world. When habit dominates, consciousness retreats. It observes less, feels less, chooses less. And the less we choose, the more we believe that things are just this way. Here one of the deepest illusions of adult life is born. Confusing repetition with destiny. There is something almost tragic in this. Because it is not about major wrong decisions, but about small, daily abdications of presence. It is as if, little by little, we outsource life to an internal autopilot. An efficient system, yes, but a blind one. It does not know what makes us feel alive. It only knows what has been done before. And when we allow it to govern without question, novelty, meaning, and transformation quietly disappear. Notice how this manifests emotionally. It is not acute suffering but a diffuse exhaustion. A sense of always being busy but rarely nourished. Always reacting but rarely creating. Many call this lack of motivation, others call it lack of purpose. But at a deeper level, it is something even more fundamental. Consciousness has stopped fully inhabiting its own actions. There is a paradox here that deserves to be felt slowly. Habits save us. They make life possible, functional, organized. Without them, we would go mad in the face of endless choices. But precisely because of this, when they are not illuminated by consciousness, they also imprison us. What protects us can quietly numb us. What organizes us can slowly distance us from ourselves. Perhaps the most delicate and most human point is this: we do not notice when this happens. Automatism does not announce its arrival. It installs itself gently, disguised as normality. That is why so many people say, I don't know when I got lost. I don't know when I stopped feeling. I don't know when life became like this. Habit does not steal life all at once. It dilutes it. But there is one essential detail that changes everything. Automatism is invisible only until it is seen. And when it is seen, not intellectually but existentially, something begins to shift inside. It is not yet change. It is not action. It is a slight awakening. A lucid discomfort. A disquiet that does not accuse but invites. Perhaps as you listen now, you notice some small pattern of your own that works this way. Something simple. A repeated gesture. A predictable reaction. An automatic thought about yourself or the world. Don't try to correct it. Don't fight it. Just observe. Because the first movement of consciousness is not to change. It is to see. And it is precisely from this gaze, still fragile, still unstable, that we begin to enter a deeper question. If so much of my life happens without me, where exactly does the possibility of choice begin? It is toward this silent, almost forgotten point that the next chapter leads us. The habit loop as the architecture of consciousness. When we look more closely at what we call habit, we realize that it is not merely a mechanical repetition of behaviors. There is something deeper, almost structural. Habit does not live only in actions. It organizes the way consciousness moves through time. It creates a predictable path between stimulus, response, and internal sensation. And little by little, this path stops being a road and becomes a comfortable prison. The so-called habit loop, cue, routine, reward, can be read as an invisible architecture of everyday consciousness. Not in a technical sense but an existential one. The cue is not only external, often it is an internal state. Emptiness, boredom, mild anxiety, a sense of inadequacy. The routine is not just what we do but the way we flee from what we feel. And the reward is almost never true pleasure. It is relief. Observe this honestly. How many times do you act not to live something full, but to stop a discomfort? Eating not to nourish but to silence. Working not to create but to anesthetize fear. Distractions not to rest but to avoid feeling. The habit loop feeds precisely on this dynamic. It promises quick relief in exchange for the temporary suspension of consciousness. There is something deeply human in this. It is not a moral failure or a lack of character. It is psychic survival. The mind learns early that feeling hurts, that holding certain emotions requires maturity, and that immediate relief is easier than sustained presence. And so habit becomes a shortcut, a silent agreement between pain and escape. The problem begins when this agreement becomes permanent. When consciousness no longer asks, "Why do I do this?" but simply executes. At that point, the habit loop stops being functional and becomes identitarian. The person no longer says, "I do this when I feel this way," but "I am this way." And this is one of the most subtle and most dangerous movements of inner life, confusing structure with essence. Notice how this shapes the experience of time. Days begin to resemble one another. Weeks pass without leaving internal marks. Life becomes efficient but shallow. Everything works but nothing truly touches. Habit, at this stage, does not just organize actions. It determines how available we are to the living experience of the present. There is a delicate point here that is rarely noticed. The habit loop is not sustained by the force of behavior, but by the emotional promise it carries. Even self-destructive habits survive because they deliver something, even if minimal, as a reward. An illusory rest, a sense of control, a temporary forgetting of oneself. As long as this promise is not seen clearly, any attempt at change will remain superficial. Perhaps you notice this in something very simple. An apparently harmless habit repeated every day. Ask yourself gently, what exactly does this give me? Not the socially acceptable answer but the honest one. Perhaps it is relief. Perhaps it is belonging. Perhaps it is a provisional identity that prevents contact with a deeper emptiness. And here an essential paradox arises. Habit does not imprison us because it is strong, but because it is predictable. It offers emotional safety in a chaotic inner world. Letting go of a habit is not just changing a routine, it is confronting the instability it was hiding. That is why so many attempts at change fail. Not because the person lacks willpower, but because they are not yet ready to hold the inner space that opens when the loop is interrupted. What Duhigg allows us to see, albeit indirectly, is that transforming a habit requires something deeper than decision. It requires awareness of the emotional circuit that sustains it. It requires a willingness to feel what was previously avoided. It requires presence where there was once escape. And this does not happen abruptly. Consciousness matures gradually, like learning to remain in an environment that once felt unbearable. We are not yet talking about change. We are talking about mapping the inner territory. recognizing that there is a silent logic organizing our repetitions. A logic that is not rational but emotional and existential. As long as it is not seen, the cycle keeps spinning, efficient, automatic, comfortable. And perhaps, as we perceive this invisible architecture of consciousness, a new question begins to emerge naturally. If habit responds to a cue, where exactly is this cue born? It is into this more internal, subtler point that we must now dive. The inner cue, where the reactions we call destiny are born. We almost always believe that we react to circumstances. That certain people provoke us, that certain situations throw us off balance, that the world pushes us toward inevitable choices. But when we observe more carefully, we notice something unsettling. What moves us is rarely outside. The true cue is born inside, silently, before any visible action. It arises as an internal state that precedes reaction, and that we often confuse with who we are. This inner cue may be an unrecognized emotion, an undigested memory, an old belief about oneself. Sometimes it is just a diffuse bodily sensation, tightness in the chest, restlessness, emptiness, and then, almost automatically, something in us moves. We say what we always say. We do what we always do. And afterward, we call this my way, my personality, my story. Little by little, habit is justified as identity. There is something deeply revealing here. The cue does not demand a specific response. It only creates tension. What decides the response is the habit. And that is exactly why, in similar situations, we repeat old patterns even when we promise to act differently. Destiny, in this sense, is not an external force. It is the repetition of unseen inner cues. Observe your own life with gentle honesty. In which moments do you react almost without noticing? In which situations does emotion arrive before consciousness? Perhaps in the face of criticism. Perhaps when you feel ignored. Perhaps when something escapes your control. These moments share something in common. They activate older parts of you, layers that learn to protect themselves very early on. The problem is not having cues. We all do. They are marks of our emotional history. The problem is living under their rule, believing they are absolute truths. When this happens, the present stops being truly new. It becomes merely a stage on which the past continues to repeat itself. There is an important subtlety here. The inner cue is not an enemy. It is a messenger. It points to something that asks for attention, integration, maturation. But when we do not listen, it shouts through behavior. Habit then becomes the language of what was not consciously processed. Perhaps you notice this in disproportionate reactions. A small frustration that generates great irritation. A simple comment that awakens an old pain. A silence experienced as rejection. In these moments, we are not in the present. We are visiting wounds that have not yet learned how to be cared for. The symbolic reading here is clear. While the cue governs, freedom is illusory. Not because we have no choice, but because we always choose from the same internal point. Consciousness, to mature, needs to descend to this invisible place where reactions are born. Not to judge, but to recognize. And this recognition does not happen in the heat of reaction. It happens afterward in silence. When we revisit the scene and ask sincerely, what did this touch in me? Not, who is wrong, but what was activated? This simple shift in question completely changes our relationship with habit. Little by little, something begins to transform. The cue still appears, but it is no longer absolute. There is a small space between emotion and action. A subtle interval where consciousness begins to breathe. This space does not eliminate discomfort, but it prevents it from immediately becoming repetition. And perhaps it is in this interval, still unstable, still fragile, that an essential discovery emerges. We do not react only to act. We react in order to feel something. To relieve, to compensate, to confirm ourselves. It is here that the next theme reveals itself clearly, the invisible reward that sustains every habit. Reward or escape. The hidden desire behind every repetition. There is a quiet belief that runs through almost all our repetitions. The idea that something just ahead will make us feel better. Even when we know a certain habit is not good for us, something in us keeps returning to it. Not out of naivety, but out of emotional necessity. Repetition at this level is not sustained by pleasure, but by the promise of relief. And this promise is powerful. When we talk about reward, we need to shift our gaze. We are not speaking only of obvious pleasure, satisfaction, or joy. Often, the true reward is the temporary suspension of pain. An interval, a forgetting, an inner silence. Habit, then, is not sought because it is good, but because it is familiar. It delivers something predictable in an unpredictable inner world. Notice how this appears in daily life. Some habits arise at the end of the day when emotional fatigue accumulates. Others appear in the face of frustration, loneliness, or a sense of inadequacy. In all of them there is a hidden desire, not to feel what is there. The reward in this case is not living something new but avoiding something old. This is a delicate point because it touches something deep in the human condition. We all seek relief from suffering. The problem is not the desire for relief but the way we learn to obtain it. When habit becomes the only known path to that relief, it stops being a choice and becomes emotional dependence. Perhaps you notice this in habits that appear precisely when you promise to change. When you decide to be more conscious, more present, more attentive. Curiously, this is when certain impulses grow stronger. Not because the change is wrong, but because it threatens to remove an old reward. The psyche reacts, trying to preserve what has always worked, even if it works poorly. There is something deeply paradoxical here. Many rewards are, in fact, refined forms of escape. Escape from unprocessed feelings. Escape from postponed decisions. Escape from encountering oneself. And the more we avoid this encounter, the more habit strengthens as the mediator of our relationship with life itself. The symbolic reading of the work leads us to a broader understanding. Habit does not only repeat behaviors, it organizes desire. It teaches us what to seek and what to avoid. Little by little, the field of experience narrows. We want the same sensations, the same reliefs, the same familiar endings. And this comes at a subtle cost. Life loses depth. Emotions become either shallow or excessively intense. Pleasure becomes quick but empty. Rest does not restore. Repetition anesthetizes but does not nourish. Habit fulfills its function, but leaves behind a trail of dissatisfaction we do not know how to name. Perhaps the most transformative point is this. As long as we seek the reward without investigating the desire that sustains it, we remain trapped in the cycle. Consciousness matures when we dare to ask, what am I really seeking here? Not the social answer but the honest one. Safety? Belonging? Validation? Rest? Well, this question does not need to be answered immediately. It needs to be held, felt, left open. Because when we touch the real desire, we realize something unsettling. Habit delivers only a diminished version of what we seek. It promises much and offers little. But until we see this clearly, we keep returning. And it is precisely here that one of the greatest illusions of modern life emerges. The belief that willpower alone is enough to break this cycle. It is this illusion, so widespread and so exhausting, that we now need to examine more carefully. The illusion of willpower and the myth of the rational self. For a long time, we were taught to believe that change is a matter of firm decision. That wanting is enough. That if something does not change, it is because there was not enough effort. This narrative is seductive because it offers a sense of control, but it carries a silent weight, guilt. When we fail, we do not question the method, we question our worth. Something in me is not strong enough. And thus, the cycle is reinforced. The symbolic reading of the power of habit gently dismantles this myth, even if we do not always notice it. The idea that we are predominantly rational beings, making conscious decisions at every moment, does not withstand honest observation of everyday life. Most of our choices happen before consciousness arrives. Willpower, in this context, is not the source of change, it is merely a limited resource easily depleted. Observe your own experience. On days when you are emotionally tired, overloaded, or empty, willpower simply does not show up. Not because you are weak, but because it was never meant to sustain deep transformations on its own. It works better as punctual support, not as an existential foundation. The myth of the rational self creates a distorted image of who we are. It makes us believe there is a conscious center governing everything, when in fact we are crossed by emotional layers, implicit memories, and old automatisms. When we ignore this, we try to change behaviors without touching the structure that sustains them. It is like rearranging furniture in a house whose foundations are unstable. There is something deeply inhuman in the constant demand for self-control. It turns inner growth into a war. The person begins to monitor themselves, to charge themselves, to mentally punish themselves for every relapse. In this state, consciousness contracts even more. And paradoxically, the harsher the demand, the more the habit finds strength to return, as a form of relief from inner tension. Perhaps you recognize this cycle. You decide to change. You pressure yourself. You fail. You blame yourself. You seek relief in the very habit. And then you promise once again to be stronger next time. This movement does not lead to maturity, it leads to exhaustion. It is no wonder so many people feel tired of trying to change. What begins to emerge here is a more compassionate and more effective understanding. Change is not an act of force but of emotional intelligence. It is not about dominating oneself but about understanding oneself. Consciousness grows when we replace confrontation with listening, rigidity with curiosity, guilt with lucid responsibility. This does not mean passivity. It means precision. It means recognizing that willpower works best when applied to environment, structures, and contexts, and not only against inner impulses. Changing a habit, in this sense, is changing the scenario in which it is born and sustained. There is a quiet freedom in this understanding. When we stop seeing ourselves as flawed and begin to see ourselves as systems that are learning, something relaxes inside. Change stops being a battlefield and becomes a process of inner reorganization. And perhaps it is exactly here that we touch something even deeper. Habits are not only individual. They are sustained by belonging, by bonds, by collective identities. It is in this territory where the I meets the we that the next chapter opens. Identity, belonging, and the habits that keep us the same. There are habits that are sustained not only because they relieve us emotionally, but because they keep us belonging. Belonging is a deep need prior to reason. Early on, we learn that being accepted requires adaptation. We adjust behaviors, silence parts of ourselves, repeat patterns that guarantee place, recognition, safety. Over time, these adjustments cease to be conscious and begin to look like identity. When we look at habits through this lens, something essential is revealed. Many of them do not exist to make us well, but to keep us included. Included in groups, narratives, roles, family expectations. Habit, then, is not only personal, it is relational. It preserves bonds even when those bonds no longer nourish. Notice how this appears in adult life. Certain ways of speaking, reacting, positioning oneself seem natural, but carry a history of adaptation. Perhaps you recognize yourself as the strong one, the responsible one, the one who doesn't complain, the one who always gives in. These roles are maintained by subtle emotional habits. They organize coexistence, but they demand a silent price: inner stagnation. There is a deep fear behind this, and it is rarely named. The fear of losing one's place. The fear of disappointing. The fear of no longer being recognized. When a habit is tied to identity, changing does not just feel risky, it feels threatening. As if, by abandoning the pattern, something essential might be lost along with it. The symbolic reading of the power of habit points to this invisible layer. We are not just individuals trying to change behaviors, we are networked beings sustained by systems of belonging. And as long as these systems are not recognized, any change feels too lonely to sustain. Perhaps you notice this when you try to act differently and encounter external resistance. Subtle comments, discomfort in the environment. It is not that people do not want your good, it is that change disorganizes the system's balance. The old habit kept everything predictable. The new one generates uncertainty. And then a silent dilemma arises: remain faithful to your own transformation, or preserve the bond as it has always been. Often we choose without realizing it. We return to the familiar, the predictable, the old role. Not out of cowardice but out of misunderstood love. The problem is that when identity crystallizes around old habits, life begins to lose movement. We grow biologically but not existentially. We keep reacting as older versions of ourselves, even when the context already demands maturity, presence, and choice. There is a turning point here that deserves to be felt. Consciousness matures when we realize that true belonging does not require self-abandonment. That healthy bonds reorganize themselves around truth, even if this generates temporary discomfort. That changing is not betraying who we were, but honoring who we are becoming. This recognition does not generate immediate action. It generates tension. A creative tension between who we are and who we need to be. And this tension, when held with consciousness, begins to reveal something inevitable. There comes a moment when habit no longer sustains the soul. It is at this point of rupture, delicate, often painful, that transformation ceases to be an idea and becomes an inner necessity. It is toward this territory that the next chapter leads us. Pain, crisis, and rupture, when habit no longer sustains the soul. There comes a silent moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, when what has always worked stops working. The habit is still there, the routine keeps running, but something essential breaks inside. The reward no longer soothes. Repetition becomes exhausting. Relief is too brief. And for the first time we feel it clearly: this no longer sustains me. This moment is usually experienced as crisis. It may appear as emotional exhaustion, loss of meaning, constant irritability, or a nameless sadness. Many people try to correct this with more discipline, more control, more effort. But what is happening at a deeper level is not a malfunction. it is the maturation of consciousness. Under this reading, crisis is not a system error. It is a signal that the system has reached its limit. The habit fulfilled its function for a time, but inner life has expanded beyond it. Continuing to repeat the same pattern now requires violence against oneself. And the psyche reacts. Notice how this manifests. What once distracted now irritates. What once anesthetized now weighs heavy. What once organized now suffocates. This is not ingratitude. It is growth. The soul, if we can use that word without dogma, asks for more space, more truth, more presence. There is something deeply human in the way we resist this moment. We try to return to what once was. We repeat with greater intensity. We increase the dose, as if insistence could restore the lost relief. But the more we insist, the clearer the emptiness becomes. The crisis then deepens. This is a delicate point because many people interpret this rupture as personal failure. Something is wrong with me. I should be satisfied. Why does nothing fulfill me anymore? These questions, though painful, carry a hidden invitation to stop fleeing and begin listening. The symbolic reading here is clear. Crisis is a threshold, a portal. It separates automatic living from a more conscious possibility of existence. Not crossing it does not protect us, it only prolongs suffering. Crossing it, on the other hand, requires emotional courage, not heroic but honest. Perhaps you recognize this moment in your own history. A time when nothing changed externally but everything changed internally. A feeling of displacement, as if you no longer fit inside your own life. This discomfort does not ask for quick solutions. It asks for deep listening. At this stage, habit is no longer merely ineffective. It becomes an obstacle. Not because it is bad, but because it belongs to an earlier phase of consciousness. Insisting on it is like trying to grow while wearing clothes that no longer fit. Discomfort is inevitable. And here a silent choice emerges. Either we use the crisis as a point of inflection, or we turn it into yet another reason for anesthesia. The difference between these two responses defines not only the next habit, but the next way of being in the world. To cross this threshold, however, one fundamental thing must be understood. Transformation is not repression. It is not about forcibly eliminating the habit, but about learning to replace it consciously. It is into this subtle art, so poorly understood, that we must now enter. Replacing is not repressing, the subtle art of inner transformation. When crisis sets in, the first reaction is usually to eliminate the habit. Cut it out. Repress it. Resist it. As if transformation required a radical gesture of negation. But this approach, although common, almost never works for long. The habit returns often stronger. Not because it is invincible, but because it was misunderstood. Repression is fighting the symptom without listening to the need that created it. Replacement, on the other hand, requires awareness of the underlying desire. This is where the symbolic reading of the power of habit becomes deeply sophisticated. It is not about erasing the loop, but rewriting it. The cue continues to exist. The desire continues to demand a response. What changes is how we choose to respond. This point is essential. The habit is not an error to be eliminated, but an old solution to a real problem. When we try to suppress it without offering another form of care, we create a void the psyche cannot sustain. And so it returns to what is known, not out of weakness but out of necessity. Perhaps you have noticed this in failed attempts at change. You decided to stop something but did not know what to put in its place. The inner space became too uncomfortable. Anxiety increased. The body demanded relief. And the old habit reappeared as a familiar response. Replacing, in this sense, is not swapping one behavior for another arbitrarily. It is offering the original desire a more conscious response. If the habit served to relieve tension, the replacement must deal with tension, not merely distract from it. If it served to create belonging, the new response must generate real connection, not isolation. This requires something rare: presence. Presence at the moment of the cue. Presence to feel discomfort without acting immediately. Presence to experiment with different responses, even if they initially feel strange or insufficient. Transformation does not happen in the ideal plane, but in the body, in real time. There is a delicacy here that deserves attention. Replacing is not about doing better. It is about doing more truthfully. Sometimes the conscious response is simple: breathing, walking, writing, speaking, remaining silent. Other times, it is setting boundaries, reorganizing routines, changing environments. The criterion is not efficiency, but emotional honesty. Notice how this changes the relationship with effort. Change stops being an imposition and becomes a learning process. Each attempt is an act of listening. Each failure is information. Consciousness expands not because we always succeed, but because we remain present. There is something deeply liberating in this approach. It removes us from the logic of guilt and places us in the logic of mature responsibility. We do not need to be perfect. We need to be attentive. Transformation stops being an event and becomes a living process. And as this presence stabilizes, something subtle begins to happen. We do not change only isolated habits. We change the way we move through life. Consciousness stops being episodic and begins to become continuous. It is precisely this state, still fragile, still under construction, that leads us to the final movement before synthesis. Living as someone who chooses even in the midst of the automatic. Consciousness in motion. Living as someone who chooses. There is a delicate moment in the inner journey when we realize that life will never be free of automatisms. There will always be routines, patterns, familiar paths. Maturity lies not in eliminating them but in not being governed by them. Living as someone who chooses does not mean being conscious of everything at all times, but knowing how to return to presence when we notice we have drifted. At this stage, consciousness is not a permanent state of elevated lucidity. It is a movement, a coming and going, a remembering and forgetting. The problem is not forgetting, it is forgetting that we forgot. When we learn to recognize the signs of the automatic, something shifts profoundly in our relationship with life. These signs are subtle. Emotional rigidity, urgency without clear cause, recurring irritability, a sense of merely getting through life rather than living it. These states are not failures, they are invitations. They indicate that consciousness has withdrawn and is asking to return. Living as someone who chooses requires intimacy with oneself. It requires perceiving when we are reacting and when we are responding. Reaction is born from habit. Response is born from presence. The difference between them lies not in external action, but in the inner space that precedes it. Perhaps you have experienced this. A moment when you almost repeated an old pattern, but something in you hesitated. A small silence opened. You did nothing extraordinary, you simply did not do the habitual. That interval, however small, is a profound act of freedom. This way of living does not generate external spectacle. It generates inner alignment. Life begins to feel simpler but truer. Choices are not always easy, but they make sense. Consciousness ceases to be an effort and becomes a posture. There is an implicit ethic here. Not a rigid morality but a sensitive responsibility. Noticing the impact of one's own repetitions, not only on oneself but on others. When we change a habit, we change an entire relational field. Consciousness in motion is contagious. This stage also teaches humility. We know relapses will happen, that the automatic will return. But now it is recognized earlier. The time between noticing and acting shortens. Life gains more presence even without perfection. Perhaps the most beautiful point of this process is this: change stops being a project and becomes a way of walking. There is no arrival. There is inhabiting. Inhabiting one's body, emotions and choices with more truth. And it is from this way of being in the world, imperfect, conscious, human, that transformation ceases to be theory and becomes lived life. Here we must leave reflection and enter concrete experience. Not with concepts but with a story. The story of an ordinary day, when consciousness decides to wake up. I'm going to tell you a simple story. It is not heroic. It is not extraordinary. Precisely for that reason, it is true. It is the story of an ordinary day, one of those we almost never remember, and how, within it, something essential began to change. I woke up as always. The body rose before consciousness. The gesture of turning off the alarm was automatic, almost impatient. Still lying down, the mind was already running ahead. Commitments, pending tasks, expectations. Everything seemed normal, too familiar. And yet, there was a slight weight in the chest, not a clear anxiety, but a sense of anticipated fatigue, as if the day had already happened before it even began. On the way to work, I noticed my attention was fragmented. The body moved forward, but the mind wandered. Repetitive thoughts, old internal dialogues, familiar worries. At some point, I realized I did not remember the route I had taken. And that was when something simple, almost banal, happened. I saw the automatic in action. Not as theory, as lived experience. Later, another moment brought the day's first clear cue. A small frustration. Nothing serious. A delay, a sharp reply, a broken expectation. The body reacted before reason. Tension in the shoulders, shallow breathing, an immediate urge to escape that state. The habit was already organizing itself internally, offering its familiar solution. And that was exactly when the interval appeared. Not as a heroic decision but as one extra second of presence. A small inner silence where for the first time I did not act. I did not correct. I did not flee. I simply felt. The discomfort was there, and it was not lethal. It was just discomfort. That instant was decisive. Because in that small space I realized something I had never seen so clearly. The habit did not want to harm me. It wanted to protect me. It wanted to spare me contact with an old feeling of insufficiency. And in seeing that, something softened inside. I chose a different response. Not better. Just more honest. I took a deep breath. Walked for a few minutes. Observed the body. The thought lost strength. The emotion passed, not because it was fought but because it was welcomed. The day went on. Other cues appeared. I did not always notice in time. In some moments I repeated old patterns. But something had changed, now I could see. And seeing changes everything. At the end of the afternoon I noticed a different kind of tiredness. It was not exhaustion. It was a living fatigue. The fatigue of someone who had been present. Of someone who had not fully outsourced the day to the automatic. Small conscious choices did not make life perfect, but they made it livable. When I got home, I noticed something subtle. The old urge to anesthetize the day still existed, but it was no longer urgent. The habit still called, but its voice was softer. Because something else had grown, the capacity to remain with oneself. That day I did not change my life. I did not break all my habits. I did not reach a permanently elevated state of consciousness. But something essential happened. I stopped living an entire day without myself. And perhaps that is exactly what the work, read as a symbolic mirror, invites us to perceive. Transformation does not begin when we control everything. It begins when we stop abandoning ourselves in small moments. Habits do not disappear. They reorganize. Some lose strength. Others transform. And little by little, consciousness ceases to be an occasional visitor and becomes a possible dwelling. If there is a real invitation here, it is not grand. It is intimate. It is everyday. It is silent. Tomorrow, at some ordinary moment, perhaps while you are listening to this, a cue will arise. The automatic will try to take over. And if a small space opens, remember, you do not need to change everything. You only need to be there. Because in the end, true power is not in habit. It is in the consciousness that learns to inhabit it.